Welcome to the Body First Healing Podcast. I'm Britt Piper, survivor turned somatic experiencing practitioner and author. If you feel stuck in old patterns, overwhelmed by your emotions, or disconnected from yourself, you're in the right place. Each week, I'll share practical somatic tools, personal stories, and conversations to support you in building a more regulated and embodied life. Because you can't talk your way through healing, you have to feel your way through. Together, we'll explore what it means to come back to yourself and create a life that feels safe enough to fully live in. I am so glad that you're here. Hello, my friend, and welcome back to the Body First Healing Podcast. I am Britt Piper, survivor turned somatic experiencing practitioner, author, and creator of the Body First Healing program. And today we are talking the foundations of somatic healing. More specifically, we're going to walk through why just simply talking about trauma isn't enough when it comes to regulation and resolution, and how we can use a somatic or body-based approach to support us in that recovery process. Now, I just want to say here that this is coming from someone who has walked both paths and who still believes in the power of traditional talk therapy. So I just want to set the tone here that this conversation in no way takes away from what traditional and cognitive therapy can do, but more so, it gives an updated and deeper nuance to how the trauma and healing world are really changing, evolving, and unfolding in mainstream therapeutic practice. It's not that talk therapy is bad, it's just that we're not getting the full picture. There's more to the healing equation. So perhaps you fall into this category that I once fell into as well, which is where you can understand your trauma, but you still feel stuck in the debilitating or destructive patterns, cycles, or behaviors that are keeping you anchored to that trauma. And that's because healing isn't necessarily about insight. Healing is about integration. You see, we can read every book, we can know every pattern, and yet we can still wake up in a body that feels unsafe. So if you've ever felt like, I keep doing all the work, I've done everything that I could possibly do, yet I still feel disconnected, depleted, disheartened, or stuck, then this episode is for you. And the message that I hope that you walk away from today's conversation with is that you don't need to know more, you don't need to learn more, you just need to feel safe. All right, you guys, so let's dive in. First, I want to kind of set the record straight with the updated science when it comes to cognitive healing. So some of our most common beliefs and practices in the medical world when it comes to healing trauma date back to the 1700s. This is when René Descartes, who was a French philosopher, famously stated, "I think, therefore I am." And as I walk you through the updated science today, you're going to find that that term really should have said, "I feel, therefore I am." And even when we look back into ancient Greek philosophy, psyche wasn't just the mind as we think of it today. The word psycho actually comes from the Greek root psyche, which means soul or breath or life force. So you can kind of think of it as like the animated essence of being, the part of us that lives, that feels, and animates the body. But over time, Western science kind of reduced that meaning. When psychology emerged in the late 1800s, it was defined as the study of the mind and behavior, which really severed it from its original spiritual and embodied roots. And even more so, when we look at the word psychology, psycho comes from the root word soul. So although psychology was meant to be the study of the soul, somewhere along the way, it became the study of symptoms and the study of the mind. We have gotten to this place in the past 200 years where we've started to believe that the mind is the core of being. And this became the foundation of Western dualism, the idea that the mind and the body are separate, with the mind having rational thought placed above the body, which is sensation, instinct, and emotion. And it is this flawed belief, which we'll get into today, that has really shaped everything from modern medicine to psychology and is precisely what somatic work gently undoes. So you could say that Descartes said, I think, therefore I am, but the body says, I feel, therefore I know I am alive. So not only do we see this within medicine and the treatment of trauma over the past roughly 100 years, but we also see it in our culture. We see it in the way that culture glorifies intellect and mindset over embodiment. And this isn't to take away from mindset practices like mindfulness or meditation or positive affirmations or any kind of cognitive framework for more optimal well-being and wellness. But the problem lies in the fact that we put all of our stock into the mind. And in doing so, we discard the primal intelligence, the ancient wisdom of the body. We often confuse understanding with healing. And although awareness opens doors, only the body can really walk through them. And it's really quite simple if you think about it. We can think up anything in our mind, but if our body doesn't experience it, then it will only ever be a vision, an idea, or a knowing. So let's get into the science. First, I want to talk about the difference between top-down versus bottom-up healing. Now, a common way that people often describe it is that top-down modalities to healing focus on the brain, whereas bottom-up focus on the body. But the more in-depth description here is that top-down modalities to healing really work with the top regions of the brain, more specifically the neocortex, which is where cognition, learning, verbal language live, like speaking and words and thinking. This is our center for rationale. And this is also where our narrative, or what we call our explicit memory or verbal memory, is stored. Now, bottom-up modalities, on the other hand, focus on the bottom regions of the brain. So not the conscious, cognitive, what we call cortical brain, but the below subconscious, subcortical parts of the brain, known as the midbrain, which is the limbic system or the mammalian brain, and the brain stem at the very bottom of that triune three-part brain. And this brain stem is also commonly referred to as the reptilian brain. But these two regions, the brain stem and the limbic system, are our subconscious, subcortical brain. And the language here is going to be emotion, impulse, and sensation. And this is where implicit or body memory is stored, like muscle memory or sensory memory or emotional memory, or what we call procedural memory, which is the common and habitual way that we react to things. So bottom-up approaches work with the body, but more specifically, these lower regions of the brain, in order to bring about resolve and resolution when it comes to trauma recovery. Now, let me just walk you through really quickly what the different roles and responsibilities of the limbic system and the brainstem are. So that midbrain limbic system is in charge of our emotions. This is also where our center of attachment is located and our center for connection, which makes sense, right? Because when you think about emotions, what's the symbol that we use? The heart, right? So you can think of this part of the brain as your heart center. And the limbic system is also what houses this little teeny tiny kidney bean structure called the amygdala. Now, you might be familiar with the amygdala, but the amygdala is known as the fear or the threat center. Think of it as the alarm system of your life. Anytime you feel triggered or you feel activated, that amygdala turns on and it initiates the survival responses of the nervous system. And then the brainstem, which is going to be at the base of the skull, this is what houses your cerebellum. Your cerebellum is in the lower back part of the head. And it's here that all of the major bodily functions are governed. And it makes sense, right? Because this is the part of the brain that connects to the body. But this is what controls your impulses, your sensory motor system, so your senses, all of the major body systems, like your respiratory system, your digestive system, your cardiovascular system, endocrine system, immune system, reproductive system, and more. And so the nervous system oversees all of this, not the neocortex, not the conscious cortical brain. So this is why we might know, or we can analyze, or we can identify what our triggers are, but we perhaps still freeze when we're in conflict, or we still freak out or want to run away anytime someone comes too close. Now, another thing I want to point out here, that when we talk about trauma, there are a couple of things that happen in the brain. So let's go back to that amygdala. And I want to walk you just really quickly, kind of surface level view here of what happens when you experience a trigger, or what we like to call an activation. So what happens is, through this concept called neuroception, which neuroception is the way that your subconscious mind and your body detect threat without your conscious mind's awareness. This is a key component of the polyvagal theory, which is the newest and updated research from Stephen Porges of the nervous system. And I was trained at the Polyvagal Institute. This is something that we deeply explore within the Body First Healing program. But again, you can think of neuroception as the security system of your mind and body. And it's constantly scanning for safety or danger, safety or danger. And this happens in 3 places: inside, outside, and between. So internally, it's tracking your body. Like, is your heart pounding out of your chest, or is it nice and regulated? It's tracking externally for safe or not safe. And it's tracking between you and other nervous system for either cues of connection or cues of warning. And anytime there is a neuroceptive cue of danger, then what happens is the reptilian brain, the brain stem, which again is in charge of that sensory motor system where this sensing and this scanning is happening, that reptilian brain will then sound an alarm up to the amygdala. Turn on, we're in danger. And again, this happens outside of our rational mind. This is happening down in the irrational feeling mind. Now, when the amygdala turns on that alarm, there are a couple of things that happen. First of all, that neocortex, that talking, thinking, remembering part of the brain starts to dim. Or you can think of it like it's been put on the back burner so that the survival parts of the brain can conserve energy to complete the role of keeping you alive. What also happens when the amygdala turns on is that the floodgates of hormones through the hypothalamus are released. And these stress or survival hormones are known as adrenaline and cortisol, and they are there to mobilize you to either fight or flee. So when the amygdala turns on and releases these hormones, it initiates our survival responses of fight, flight, shutdown, freeze, fawn, or functional freeze. And when this happens, that means that the amygdala and the nervous system have essentially taken control of the wheel. Okay, so now that I've walked you through that, now I want to give you what I believe to be the best updated definition of what trauma is. Trauma can be described as any event or experience that overwhelms your nervous system's capacity to cope. And when that happens, your nervous system gets stuck in a state of survival. Now, this can happen developmentally if you grow up in an environment where, when your nervous system is still young and vulnerable and underdeveloped, there are experiences either inside, outside, or between that don't feel safe and that wire your nervous system and your brain structures for survival, where the amygdala is constantly being activated and hijacked. And then this plays on through the rest of your adult life. It starts to show up as symptoms like anxiety or fatigue or rage or depression. It can show up behaviorally through maladaptive coping patterns, or what I call survival strategies, such as addiction, people-pleasing, overworking, or overachieving. And so although we might be aware of these patterns later on in life, Trauma isn't necessarily an idea or a thought that we can debate with. It's not an insight that we gather. It's not something that we learn and then everything changes. Trauma is an imprint that is written within the flesh, the fascia, the breath, the blood, the ways that the body responds and reacts to activation or triggers that feel similar to the past. And this is why we say we can't necessarily tell our nervous system to become regulated. We have to show it. So ultimately, just to kind of re-summarize this, the neuroscience of why just talking about your trauma is not enough is, number one, trauma lives in implicit memory in the body and not in the story. You guys have heard me probably say it before in previous episodes, but Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, the author of The Body Keeps a Score, says that trauma comes back not as a memory necessarily, but as a reaction. And these are the impulses, the emotional memory, the procedural patterns of how the nervous system responds to stress, to triggers, and activation. It's these procedural or body-based patterns that we can get stuck in, even if they're incongruent with today's reality. For instance, the ways that we dissociate, go numb, or completely shut down in a work setting where there's constructive criticism or productive suggestions, because it triggers the old body memory of being overly corrected or criticized in childhood, where we would perhaps be punished or neglected or met with ridicule if we didn't do things perfectly. So, trauma lives in that implicit memory, in that reaction in the body, and not necessarily in the story. Coming back to our summary here, the prefrontal cortex and that neocortex really dims when the amygdala fires up, which is why reasoning can't override the survival strategies of the body. In other words, we can't talk safety into a body that still feels unsafe. Furthermore, when we talk about the vagus nerve, which is the information superhighway of the body and brain, that vagus nerve runs from the body up to the brain and the brain down to the body. And what Stephen Porges found in his polyvagal theory research is that 80% of the vagus nerve fibers go from body up to brain, and only 20% go from brain down to body, which means that the body has a lot more say than the mind when it comes to how we feel, how we think, how we respond and react to things in our life. And this is why when your body thinks that you're in danger, there's no amount of mindset that will convince it otherwise. Okay, so now that we have the basics, now let's get into the body's language. So in the somatic, which means body-based, in the somatic world, we work with the language of the body. And the body speaks so many languages, but some of the most common that we explore in our sessions with our clients is going to be through sensation, temperature, breath, movement, tears, and impulse. And what's actually really fun is in the Body First Healing program, anyone who joins gets a vocabulary list of sensations and a vocabulary list of emotions to start learning the language of their body. Now, in this modern world that we live in, we are so incredibly disconnected and really dissociated from the neck down. And what can be problematic about this is that we are finding that we are living our lives narrating instead of noticing, instead of being present with our body, instead of honoring where it's at. And so this shows up as maybe waking up first thing in the day and thinking through your to-do list or all that you have to get done without checking in to see, is my body tired? How am I feeling today? What sensations am I noticing? Oh, my muscles feel actually kind of collapsed and I feel a bit shut down. My joints feel achy. My stomach is in knots. And the beautiful thing about this work is that when we start to live from a more embodied perspective, it becomes so much easier to take off the old survival strategies and armor of the past. And that's because healing begins when we stop explaining and when we start experiencing. You see, when we become more connected to the body, we can start to notice things like, oh, when so-and-so asked me if I wanted to go out to lunch and I just said yes, now that I'm checking in with my body, there's some constriction in my chest. I'm noticing that there's a forced smile and that my cheeks kind of ache a little bit. I actually realize in this moment I'm fawning, and that from a more embodied perspective, I don't want to go to lunch with that person. And so by allowing ourselves to be with our somatic experience, which is the experience of the body, we can create new choices, new patterns, new evidence, and new history. So not only do we learn how to track our body's language and listen in moment to what it's telling us, but as we start to lean into that awareness, we also start to observe these wonderful cycles within our body, what I often refer to as our biorhythm. And in somatic experiencing, we refer to this as pendulation. So these are kind of like cycles of contraction and expansion. Another way you can think of it is this is our stress response cycle, which goes through its stress response cycle roughly 100 times a day. But let me just use an analogy to really illustrate this. So imagine a grandfather clock that oscillates back and forth, back and forth. Now, on one side of that pendulum is what we call activation, which is like when we're triggered, when we feel constricted or shut down or collapsed. And on the other side of that grandfather clock is deactivation. And this is where we feel expanded, open, relaxed, and not activated. We feel safe. Now, throughout the day, this pendulum goes back and forth, which means there are going to be moments where we do feel activated, moments where we need to lean into a little bit of healthy activation and mobilization to use our cortisol and adrenaline to work out or to get that project turned into our boss in time, to get the kids from school, to hold on to the steering wheel tightly when someone cuts us off on the road. We oscillate. And then where we come into deactivation, settling, when we're sitting down to eat, hopefully we're sitting down and eating slowly. When we're co-regulating with someone, when we're breathing in fresh air, when we're cuddling with our dog, when we're winding down at night, we move back and forth, pendulating between expansion and contraction, deactivation, activation all day long. And as we start to learn the language of the body, we can sense into those cycles with more presence and with more attunement. We can notice the moments where we feel stuck in the constriction. We can notice patterns of scenarios or environments where certain people bring us into deactivation and openness. And this, again, is the difference between knowing what we know and feeling what we feel. And as we start to grow that awareness and that acceptance that the body doesn't just heal through words, that it heals through movement, through presence, through feeling, then the questions of why am I like this can start to change to what is my body asking for right now? The amount of clarity and compassion that comes when you start to do this work is immeasurable. All right, so let's transition here into somatic experiencing and what people often refer to as releasing trauma or completing the story, completing the experience. Now, this is something that, again, talk therapy cannot do. So in somatic experiencing, we work with the body to complete the unfinished survival responses of the past. The ways that we couldn't escape, the ways that we couldn't advocate for ourselves, the times that we couldn't express, that we couldn't grieve. We allow the body to do in the here and now what it couldn't do back then. And there's a certain physiological component to this. So again, going back to that knowing that trauma is any experience that overwhelms the nervous system's capacity to cope. Now, when this happens, the nervous system gets stuck in the survival responses that it enlisted in the past. Here's a beautiful quote by Dr. Peter Levine, who's the developer of somatic experiencing, that says that trauma is an internal straitjacket. And think of that as the nervous system, when a devastating moment becomes frozen in time. And so again, it's like the body and the nervous system and the subconscious brain are stuck in the survival of the past. And our work is to help the nervous system catch up to what the mind already knows in the present, which is that we are now safe. But the nervous system is not a thinking, rational brain, right? It's an impulsive, emotional, feeling system. And so we have to show the body and the nervous system, not tell it that the threat of the past is gone. Now, when we get trapped in these survival states, that also means that the adrenaline and the cortisol, or the stress or survival hormones that were released by the hypothalamus into the body, are still stuck within our physiology. And what happens over time is these stress hormones begin to turn into chronic stress hormones. And it's this muscling up, this armoring up against life and this invisible threat that starts to wear globally on the working systems of the body that I mentioned earlier, like the cardiovascular, the immune system, the digestive system, and more. And this is why we see so many somatic symptoms following trauma that has not been resolved yet through the body. So in somatic experiencing, what we do is we start to gently touch into the patterns or the survival strategies that are still being enlisted today, with the intention of allowing the body in the here and now to start moving through that process to release the adrenaline and cortisol. Now, I'll use myself as an example, and I've shared this in a previous episode, but for instance, I experience a physical assault. What happened in this experience is I was overpowered by my perpetrator, even though I tried to fight back. That meant that the adrenaline and cortisol was still trapped within my physiology. Following the assault, I became an entirely different person. I became angry. I was full of rage, which was not in my normal nature. But again, my nervous system became physiologically stuck in this thwarted or incomplete fight response. And so I found myself in patterns or cycles or environments that promoted some of this rage that often look like copious amounts of drinking, followed by some kind of verbal altercation with someone. Now, I just want to add, I'm many years removed from this and have done a lot of work to work through it. But as I've shared in a previous episode about this and in my book, in working with a somatic therapist, my prescription alongside that practitioner was to start to touch into anger in our sessions together. I'd be asked questions like, what's something that upset you lately or pissed you off? And by touching into everyday moments, like someone ignoring a text message for multiple days and not getting back to me, or being cut off on the road, that I would start to experience anger in these small, tolerable doses within my body and physiology. My practitioner would guide me to be with that anger in a way that felt manageable, and then allowed for moments where it could then be released from the body. That might come through tears, it might come through trembling or shaking, it might come through heat and sweating, it might come from vocalizing, saying something, or moving my body. And it was in these experiences that my body and nervous system were able to finally release, or what we call discharge, those stress hormones that had been suppressed within my system. And so in this framework, we can say that somatic work does not break you down. It brings you back into rhythm, back into the pendulation, rather than having a broken grandfather clock. Through this lens, we can say that healing isn't necessarily about storytelling, it's about story completion. Allowing yourself to do now what you couldn't do back then. And as people start to step into this work, there again becomes this awe and this reverence for the way that the body was biologically hardwired for self-healing. You see, your body knows the way home. It's just been waiting for safety long enough to show you. All right, my friends. So let's start to transition the conversation here to a close. And I really just want to touch on here why this matters, why this conversation matters. I think today when we look at the state of the world, and in particular, when we look at the state of women's health, women account for 83% of autoimmune disease here in the United States. And researchers, medical doctors, health specialists are starting to really get down to this root cause issue. And that is that a lot of these chronic conditions can be tied back to the chronic stress and chronic survival mode that many women live in today. Whether it's the self-silencing that women do by not expressing their wants, needs, desires, boundaries, or prioritizing other people above themselves. It is this chronic muscling through and armoring up through life that is creating this allostatic wear and tear on the mind and body. We have the highest cases of exhaustion, chronic fatigue, anxiety, and autoimmune flare-ups that we've ever seen. And one of the biggest issues that we face is in recognizing that these are not mindset problems. They are physiological cries for safety, for settling, and for support. And so with this knowing, we have to recognize that we cannot just journal, mindset, manifest, and meditate our way out of what is fundamentally a body and physiological and nervous system problem. And furthermore, we have to stop looking at the body as a problem to fix. It is not a problem to fix. Your body and its symptoms are not betraying you. It is actually begging for you to listen. And the more that we can get out of the logical and rational meaning making of what is wrong with us, air quotes there, the quicker that we can come into relationship and into rhythm with our body in a more compassionate and connected way, then the healthier we can be, the more vitality we will have access to, the more present we can be and aligned we can be in our lives. So all that to say, healing is a returning to the relationship with the body, not a mastering over it. All right, now before we bring this episode to an end, if someone were to ask you, what's a great place to start when it comes to somatic healing, I would guide them to this episode. And I would let them know the cliff notes of what this episode is going to be about. And really, it's this summary that you cannot think your way into safety. You have to feel your way there. Regulation begins in these micro moments of safety, not these massive breakthroughs. And that finally, healing is not about understanding more. It's about experiencing differently. So with that said, I want to lead you into just a short somatic moment where we can feel ourselves settle into the safety of the body. So I'll invite you, if it feels comfortable, to just start to notice the weight of your body in this moment. Maybe you're moving around, maybe you're doing the dishes, maybe you're on a walk. Can you start to feel the rhythm of the body as it moves forward, backward, side to side? If you're sitting, can you feel the sturdiness of your sit bones? Can you feel your anchor in your bottom, in your spine? Can you start to notice the slow and rhythmic movement of the breath? Just noticing and observing as the breath goes in through the nose, into the lungs, filling the chest, down into the belly, and releasing. And again, just another inhale through the nose. Breathing in that vitality, that life force, filling the body with aliveness, with newness, and exhaling. And as we're doing this, just start to notice any shifts, any settling that's taking place in the body. Is the face relaxing? Are the shoulders dropping? Maybe the tongue has fallen down into the bottom of the mouth. Are your hands opening? Is the belly expanding? Are the legs settling? Just notice any area of the body that's feeling easier to be with. And now I'll invite you, if it feels okay and if it's safe to do so, maybe not while driving, but just slowly orient to the left, allowing the eyes, the neck, and the head to shift their attention. And now bringing the eyes, neck, and head to center. Just noticing what's in front of you with more of a wide peripheral gaze. And then finally, shifting our attention, moving our eyes, neck, and head to the right. Noticing what's to the right of the body. Really observing the little nuances and details of the space around you. And come back to center. And then just begin to ask the question, how does my body know that I am here right now? Maybe there's something you feel internally. I can feel my stomach gurgling a little bit. I think I'm hungry. I just noticed movement outside my window as a car drove past. I can hear the hum of a truck outside. I can smell the aroma of the candle that I lit this morning down in the living room. And I can feel my back against the chair, the support on my spine. My fingers are clasped together and I can feel the warmth of my hands. And a breath that feels like a thank you. So again, even in these few moments that we allowed ourselves to just be a bit more present, we were able to bring the nervous system, to bring the body, and probably even bring the mind into a bit more ease, a bit more settling, a bit more coherence. So again, just as a reminder, your body doesn't always need another explanation. It just needs an experience. If you feel like there's someone in your life that could really benefit from this kind of knowledge and this kind of approach to healing, then make sure to send this their way, especially with anyone who's done the work but still feels stuck. If you are ready to dive deep into the world of somatics and nervous system healing and trauma resolution, then you can always join me in the 6-month Body First Healing Somatic program, where we explore and experience what it means to come home to our body, to regain safety, and to get unstuck from the past. As always, remember that you can catch me here every Wednesday on the Body First Healing podcast with new episodes designed to support you in your somatic healing journey. I'll see you again here soon on the Body First Healing podcast. Bye, guys. Thank you so much for tuning into the Body First Healing podcast. If this episode resonated with you, I would be so grateful if you subscribed, left a review, or shared it with someone that you love. I'll see you back here next week, and until then, be gentle with yourself. You're doing the best you can with what you have, and that is more than enough. Just a quick note, this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for medical advice. Always consult a qualified provider for personal support.